Good morning, everyone. What I want to talk about today is actually kind of a third rail issue, and I'm relieved that this is, I think, the first public presentation of this topic that I've given that literally I haven't need armed police to protect me. I gave a very similar presentation to this, a little less scope towards domestic counterterrorism and practitioners' perspectives at a Midwestern university and a Northeastern university right after Thanksgiving. And believe it or not, it wasn't even the subject of Hamas or the Gaza war. It was that terrorism or counterterrorism was in the slide. And that seemed to excite students in not a positive way. So as the Admiral said this morning, the world is changing, and it's changing in some strange ways. And I'm actually even going to talk about that in this presentation. And in this presentation, I'm trying to do what I know David and Anders teach all of you to do, is to look at a subject, an issue of terrorism dispassionately and objectively, and pull out what are the core lessons that we have to learn to make sure something like this doesn't happen again anywhere. And that's some of the lessons of the October 7th attack. So there's basically three parts to this presentation. Very briefly, because I'm going to tell you stuff that you already know in this part, is what's the significance of what happened on October 7th. Secondly, and the more important part, what are some of the key lessons that persons involved in Homeland Security and counterterrorism everywhere in the world should be drawing about those tragic events that morning in Israel? And then, is this a struggle or a war that can be won? And what are some of the longer term implications or repercussions for both regional and global security? And I would say the kind of dark picture that the Admiral painted is very much reflected in this presentation. And she underscored exactly what one of the problems is. The policymakers don't listen to the experts or don't listen to the practitioners. We all know what's going on, but it's all about political will, and that's part of this presentation as well. So let's go to the first part. What's the significance? I mean, you've heard all of this, but it bears repeating. For Israelis and for Jewish people around the world, there was no tragedy that compares to October 7th, unless we go back to World War II and the Holocaust. On the first day of the Yom Kippur War, the last most tragic day in terms of lethality in Israel, only a quarter of the persons were killed, and they were mostly combatants. In fact, you have to go back to the first year of Israel's founding in 1948 to find 2 days where as many Jews were killed in violence. Proportionally, as President Biden has said, it's as if 40,000 Americans had been killed on 9/11 compared to our population. But I really want you to zero in on that last bullet. Between 2000 and 2004, there was the Second Intifada, the series of suicide attacks that engulfed Israel. Anybody who was in Israel at the time knows how the effectiveness of those attacks was on the verge of paralyzing Israeli society. In fact, during that period, I was embedded once with the NYPD representative in Israel, and another time for a couple of weeks with the Israeli police, so had a ringside seat to it. I wrote about it in the Atlantic Monthly. That was a bad time. But in 4 years, Hamas had managed to kill tragically fewer than 400 Israelis. In 21 hours, they bettered that by 3 times on October 7th. And that's a trend in terrorism I'm going to come back to that all of us need to be worried about. Secondly, we all know about the Maginot Line, the famous French defenses that were built in 1928 that was supposed to protect against a second German invasion of France. And we now laugh about how that failed. Well, same thing happened in Israel. 65-kilometer, billion-dollar fence, and that quotes from the Brigadier General in the Israel Defense Forces that was charged in overseeing it. This is one of the conceits of the West, or of the Northern Hemisphere. We always think we're technologically more sophisticated, more advanced than the quote-unquote, during colonial times, you would call them primitive adversaries, right? But this is a truism of terrorism throughout the ages, is that they only have to stay a half step ahead of the counterterrorism technology curve to succeed. And that's exactly what Hamas did that day. It rendered the entirety of Israel's defenses deaf and blind. And they did so not with sophisticated multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar weapon systems and platforms. They did it with what terrorists always do. They looked at off-the-shelf, commercially available materials, and they adapted them to their needs. In this case, it was quadcopters, mini drones that they outfitted just like ISIS had done a decade ago, with simple devices to drop single hand grenades. Now, during ISIS's time, a single hand grenade falling somewhere was viewed as tragic if it landed on your head, but most often it was used for harassment, for psychological operations, in essence, for disruption, to undercut morale. Hamas went way past that. They used those single hand grenades to take out the cell towers all around the smart fence, and they rendered the smart fence dumb because they completely knocked out all connectivity. All the surveillance cameras went black. All the thermal imaging sensors were rendered inert. The automatic machine guns that were supposed to catch anyone crossing the border in an enfilade, completely inoperable. Iron Dome, developed jointly with the United States military, amazingly effective, amazingly sophisticated anti-missile defense system. I actually was in Israel in the 2014 Gaza war and saw overhead, when I should have been in a bomb shelter, actually the Iron Dome at work. Absolutely amazing. I mean, you could see it in the sky taking missiles out. But yeah, it was designed to take out hundreds of missiles fired at one time, not 3,000. Completely rendered it inoperable. And then, like in all successful warfare, I always know, especially on a military base, if you want to appear smart, you cite Klaus von Clausewitz, the famous military strategist. He talks about surprise, it being the essence of war, and surprise being predicated on good security, not letting your plans leak out. Hamas definitely succeeded there. And excellent intelligence, knowing your enemy, which is actually a Sun Tzu principle. That's exactly what Hamas did. It launched, as all successful terrorist operations are, a successful deception and denial operation that completely blinded the Israelis to what they were really doing. They constantly pulsed the system. In other words, just like we heard from the 9/11 Commission about 9/11, they introduced so much chatter and so much noise that the Israelis were lulled into a sense of complacency, and a false sense of complacency and safety. From Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, from the terrorist point of view, October 7th was also without precedent, and things will never be the same. As you know, my first boss and mentor, Brian Jenkins, famously said, terrorists are more imitative than innovative. The trouble is, the few times terrorists innovate, everybody else imitates them. Now, when you look back in history, we've never seen a terrorist group be able to pull off simultaneous, coordinated air, sea, and land attacks, and to fuse those with swarming tactics. And that's exactly what we saw on October 7th. Now, to my mind, there's only two groups I can think of that had capabilities to operate on air and sea as well as land, and that was Al-Qaeda and the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. But they never were able to put it together simultaneously, and that's exactly what Hamas did. And in addition to their tactical innovations and their overwhelming of the system, which I'm going to come back to in swarming tactics, they seized 243 hostages. Now, lots of hostages had been seized before at one place at one time. Seizure of a theater in Moscow at the beginning of the century, the famous takeover of a school in South Ossetia in September 2004. But once again, Hamas innovated. They didn't hold them at one place. They took them back across Gaza, and then they dispersed them across the entire territory, which made it enormously difficult to mount any kind of counter-terrorist operation to free them. So this, beyond any stretch of the imagination, will go down in the annals of terrorism as one of the most important and successful terrorist operations in history. In fact, as you'll see in this presentation, I think the consequences are much more dire and much more serious than even on 9/11. Once again, we don't listen to the terrorists. The terrorists are always telling us what their intentions are, but throughout history, we ignore them. You only have to go back to the Hamas covenant in 1988 and see exactly what this group was about. And you'll be familiar with some of its principles: complete destruction of Israel, complete denial of any political accommodation. But I want to go down to that last sub-bullet in top. Not just the anti-Semitism that you would expect. You know, the Jews control the world's media, that Jews control the world's finances. This is a totally unhinged document. It says that Jews have set up the Rotary clubs, chambers of commerce, even the Freemasons, as part of a bid to control the world. I mean, like I said, completely unhinged. Now, admittedly, even Hamas recognized that that was totally unhinged. In 2017, revised the covenant and came out with a supposedly kinder and gentler charter. Once again, there's absolutely no difference there. Like all anti-Semitism, it blames Jews for their own misfortune and blames the travails of Israel on the principles of Zionism. But more importantly, it once again completely denies any possibility of a negotiated peace, a peaceful resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and specifically calls out the Oslo Accords, the landmark 1993, admit a very fractured roadmap towards a two-state solution, and says completely useless, completely irrelevant. So they told us exactly what they were about. And you know, one of my favorite columnists is Peggy Noonan. That's exactly what she wrote this past December, that October 7th was Hamas showing you who they are. Believe them. Now, here are three quotes. The bottom two quotes you've probably heard. I mean, one that there'll be more Al-Aqsa floods, and the other that this was just the first time, there'll be second, third, fourth. Everybody knows about that. Let's go to the top quote that's in red. This is by Salih al-Aruri, who was recently senior Hamas member, who was recently killed by the Israelis in Beirut. This is a statement he made, not in Arabic, not in the Gaza Strip, not in Qatar, or not in Beirut. He made this in London. He made it in English while he was given a platform and he was being interviewed by the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So you've heard of that Chatham House rules? That's Chatham House. That's the original sort of international affairs think tank. Look what he said almost 2 decades ago. Our job is to keep Palestinians radicalized. Most of them would settle in a moment for peace, some deal that would let them get on with their lives. We need to keep them angry. So put that in perspective of exactly what's going on or has been going on in Gaza for the past 4 months and Hamas's own cynicism towards their own people. It's not just, though, the West that looks at Hamas so negatively. You've been in this business as long as I have. You get to meet some interesting people. Also, if you're an historian like I am, you keep everything you've ever taken a note on. And when October 7th happened, all through that day, I was thinking back to a meeting I had in March 2000 with what was then the Palestine National Authority. It's now just the Palestine Authority because Gaza was hacked off of it after the 2007 civil war between the Palestine Authority and Hamas, that Hamas won and kicked out the Palestine Authority. It was a meeting I had with Yasser Arafat, right? Founder and leader of Fatah, one of the most important elements of the Palestine Liberation Organization, president of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and El Rais, the head of the Palestine National Authority. And what he said a quarter of a century ago is completely accurate to Hamas today. He nailed it. Exactly. He said Hamas could not exist without state support. And the state support then as now was coming from Iran. Back then, he also pointed to Syria being a main conduit. He also talked about the struggle for the mind and the allegiance of the Palestinian people and recognized that he was competing with Hamas and that he was competing with Hamas, and he felt at a disadvantage because the PLO was a secular organization where Hamas was all about religion and imposing its will on others. And he made the point that the Palestine Authority could win most of Hamas's supporters, but that there would always be a hardcore of 10% that they could never win over. Well, things didn't work out exactly as Yasser Arafat had thought back then, because of course in 2006, Hamas won the elections in Gaza, catapulted it into the rule of Hamas, the rule of Gaza that continues today and led to the civil war that I just described. But nonetheless, the core observation of Arafat's, and there's my notes on the left-hand side, remain true. 2 years earlier, I had actually gone to Gaza, and in years past, I've been to Gaza several times, although not since then. Although I'll say parenthetically, in 2007 or 2008, 2007, Hamas invited me to come visit with them, but that's another story. 1998, I met with the governor of Gaza, actually one of Yasser Arafat's chief lieutenants. I didn't put that note page. But look what he said. Hamas's military activity is designed to undermine the peace process. This was its raison d'etre, its mindset from the start. Okay, so that's the significance. Let's move on to the heart of the presentation, some of the key lessons. I can tell you, and those of you who live in Washington, D.C. know this, is that all you have to do is utter the word insurgency or the words insurgency or counterinsurgency inside the Beltway, and you completely empty out the room. No one wants to hear about that anymore after the 2-decade-plus long war on terror. But I'm lucky, at least at Georgetown, there are still some students who want to take my insurgency and counterinsurgency course, or at least there were. We'll see what happens in the future. One of the things we focus on in that course is a long-forgotten book called Small Wars, Principles and Practice by Brigadier General C.E. Caldwell. You can still get this book. It's a big, thick book. But the thing that we concentrate on it is his observations from the 19th century. So then Major and Colonel Caldwell spent most of his career fighting along the Durand Line. That's the artificial demarcation that the British drew in the 1830s that separates what's today Pakistan from what's today Afghanistan. And he fought against Pashtun tribesmen, basically the Taliban of today. And he was an artilleryman by training. And if you think back to the way warfare was fought at the end of the 19th century, all kinds of technological innovations were coming online. Machine gun, or its predecessors, Hotchkiss gun and the Gatling gun or the Maxim gun, for example, were just being used, which of course enabled European colonial forces to kill native indigenous forces at a much faster and more rapid rate, which would completely transform the subjugation of indigenous people. Also, too, as an artilleryman, as a gunner, many of Caldwell's colleagues were completely enamored with the new accuracy that artillery pieces were acquiring. It wasn't the in-place cannons of the past, their own rapid rate of fire, but in particular the mobility, that you could now position artillery pieces in all sorts of inhospitable terrain. And his British colleagues all thought this would be a game changer in warfare. But Caldwell was a very interesting sort of guy. He also was an incredibly gifted linguist. So he could get out and actually talk with the Pashtuns because he knew their language and their dialect. And in speaking to them, he actually transitioned from an artillery officer to intelligence officer. And one of the main conclusions in small wars is that irregular forces will always find a workaround, will always find a way to stay at least a step, if not a half step ahead of the counterterrorism technology curve. In other words, they'll always find a way to overcome even the technological mastery or superiority of their Western enemies. And that's always stuck in my mind, and not least when Staff Sergeant Salvador Giunta, first Medal of Honor winner in Afghanistan, was awarded the Medal of Honor following a particularly bloody battle in the Korangal Valley of Kunar Province, Afghanistan. And what he said in 2008 resonates completely with what Caldwell had written 104 years earlier. Sergeant Giunta said, "The richest, most trained army got beat by dudes in man-jammies and AKs." I mean, think of it from the Taliban's point of view, is they were able to successfully confront the most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind. And actually, I'll come back to this, through their mantra of persistence and perseverance, they won. They reconquered Afghanistan. I would say Israel Defense Forces, because of the degree of interoperability with the United States military, because of the military hardware that they buy from us, probably Israel Defense Forces are the second most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind. Well, again, to look smart, I'll quote Clausewitz. Clausewitz says that the essence of warfare is surprise, but also imposing your will on the enemy. There's absolutely no doubt Hamas imposed their will on Israel and probably on the rest of the world too, in a very asymmetric way, using, as I described, off-the-shelf technology. So that's the first lesson. Second lesson is the risk of stating the obvious: counterterrorism. If terrorism is becoming more complex and more complicated, counterterrorism is becoming infinitely more complex and more consequential. Think of the most consequential terrorist incidents of this century. 9/11, Madrid 2004, London 2005. What made them, Bali bombings, for example, we can throw in there. What made them consequential? They were simultaneous terrorist operations. But take that a step further. Take that to Mumbai in 2008 and Paris in 2015, where they're not only simultaneous, but they're coordinated and they use swarming techniques. And what's the effect? The response is completely paralyzed. First responders are overwhelmed in responding to multiple terrorist incidents occurring simultaneously that are not static, that are moving along a city. 22 Israeli communities, including a music festival, attacked all at once. What happens in swarming attacks? At least at this stage of the game, the response is completely shattered and paralyzed. Decision-making and command and control is totally thrown off, and panic and, in turn, tragedy ensues. And think about October 7th transposed to cities in the world, to any other country in the world. Multiple swarming drone attacks using cheap, off-the-shelf, commercially available quadcopters that are rigged to drop single grenades. Even if they don't kill anyone, you start to have multiple attacks in one city at one time, multiple cities at the same time. We're in a completely different world. And this, in my view, is coming. You just have to look at the warfare in Ukraine and how successful Hamas was with this aviation tactic. You all may know much better than me. I've since given up my clearances. Although I regularly talk to military and law enforcement, I still have not gotten a satisfactory answer of how we respond to multiple drone attacks in any single municipality. Second thing is, strategically, it's becoming much more complicated and much more complex. And this is something anybody who was in Iraq, and David will have known it, and David actually mentioned it, is how we were attacked back then. IDs was, of course, a very big part of it. But what stuck in my mind from 2004, and actually what nearly killed David in one occasion, was the use of indirect fire by terrorists. The constant barrage of rockets, missiles, cheap fire-and-forget weaponry, but that were enough to be disruptive and certainly threatening. So this had become a fixture of terrorist operations already 2 decades ago, and it's one that we noticed, and we noticed it particularly in 2006 in the Second Lebanon War, where Hezbollah did not send, despite their own mythology, one suicide terrorist, one human being to attack Israel. Instead, they launched 4,000 missiles that in that era could only reach the north of Israel. That's chump change now. Hezbollah back then only had about 15,000 rockets and missiles. Today they have an estimated 130,000 to 150,000 rockets and missiles. They can fire thousands per day, whereas they can only fire hundreds. And we already know what the consequences of firing thousands of rockets per day were on October 7th. Not only that, the missiles are much more accurate. Instead of the fire and forget kind of Katyushas they had almost 20 years ago, they have things like the Fateh 110 that has an accuracy within a kilometer compared to almost 4 kilometers 2 decades ago. And not only that, Hezbollah from the north can completely blanket the entirety of Israel today with missiles if he wanted. To the extent that Israeli economists predict that you're wondering why Israel is holding back in attacking Hamas? Because they've been warned that if that breaks out into a full-scale war, the economic damage that could be inflicted on Israel because of that weapon. These are terrorists firing weapons that we associate with conventional militaries, would probably derail, if not destroy, the Israeli economy for at least 5 years. So warfare now, in terms of asymmetric tactics and asymmetric enemies, is approaching an entirely new dimension. Third, going back to swarming attacks. As I said, at least terrorist swarming attacks thus far in history have inevitably produced chaos, disorder, paralysis, bloodshed, and of course, tragedy. Think about it. Israel, the Israel Defense Forces, Israeli military intelligence, Israeli civilian intelligence are vaunted as the most sophisticated or the best in the Middle East. There's so many TV shows now out about them. Fauda, for example, Tehran, that talk about their sophistication and actually their omniscience. and then reflect on the sad, melancholy events of October 7th. Hamas was so successful that it took the Israel Defense Forces over an hour to even figure out that terrorists had crossed the border on foot, and they were completely unaware that they were coming across on hang gliders. It was nearly 2 hours before Israel declared a state of alert. It was nearly 4 hours before the Israeli Air Force took to the skies. You want to talk about a successful terrorist operation? This one, because of the swarming tactics, because of the intelligence, because of the element of surprise, and because of the element of deception, in my view, has rewritten the history of terrorism. And then it's not until 21 hours later that the last kibbutz is finally secured, that the killing stops. When you look at the transcripts that are now available on the internet, the New York Times published them, Haaretz has published them, the Israeli newspapers, there's like a theme from noon onwards. We're talking about 6 hours after the attacks are launched, where civilians are saying, where is the army? So the trust that is the Israeli population once had in its military and intelligence has been completely shattered. And how it's rebuilt, I think, is still an open question. Fourth, at the risk of stating the obvious, is that terrorism today has become as intersectional as it is international. You know, the old saw, the old wisdom was that Shia and Sunni don't cooperate. Well, who is Hamas's biggest patron? Hamas is a Sunni group and is very closely aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, but its biggest patron is Iran, of course. But what's been happening in the weeks and months since the attack is virtually every single Sunni as well as Shia terrorist organization has been expressing solidarity with Hamas and pledging its support. I would imagine pledges that in time will be made good on. So this has become an issue that has united terrorists of the world against Israel and also against its main patron, the United States, or its main supporter, the United States. And then fifth, and the final lesson, although this I'm going to break down into 4 parts, is that the war on narrative nowadays counts as much, if not more, than the actual kinetic, physical war. Here's an example of an infographic created very helpfully by the Iranian news agency in Russian. It basically compares the Israel Defense Forces to ISIS. And actually, you know, propaganda doesn't have to be true. It just has to be believed. And this puts forth a pretty compelling case. And this is just a sample of the disinformation, the misinformation, the fake news that not only Iran, but Russia especially, China to a certain extent, and other countries are using to marshal international opinion, not just against Israel, but especially against the United States and those Western countries that have declared their support for Israel. Secondly, war on narratives. Think about the platform that Hamas has today. And this isn't Bruce Hoffman speaking. This is complaints I hear from officials at the State Department who are involved in public diplomacy. They said, how can we counter a 24/7 respectable news platform, Al Jazeera, that has become a mouthpiece for Hamas, that has basically given Hamas's leaders on a daily basis a megaphone in which to inflame, radicalize, and goad to violence the entirety of a region. And that made me think, what if Osama bin Laden, after 9/11, could count on the powerful cable media news platform of an established nation state? War on terror probably would have gone in a very different direction. The use of the Qatar news agency and the use of Al Jazeera has proved absolutely pivotal for Hamas to gain the upper hand in this war on narrative. And you just have to look at the numbers on all social media and see that the sort of Hamas platforms versus the pro-Hamas versus pro-Israeli, I mean, it's night and day in terms of the number of followers and supporters. Also, too, the Muslim Brotherhood, which for decades, one could argue almost a century since its founding, actually it's exactly a century, since its founding, has always played a curious game, saying that they're only for peaceful change, that they're a nonviolent organization, that they're not unified, that it's different Muslim Brotherhood parties in different countries react differently. But look at the full-throated endorsement for violence and for jihad, for holy war, that they have issued and basically laid down their marker that they're not about peaceful and democratic change anymore. They're not talking about a two-state solution. They're talking about violence. Third, and what really worries me, is that terrorism was already bad enough. We all know that. 3,000 persons perished on 9/11. It's become worse. It's become almost pornographic in its violence. And we saw this firsthand up close with ISIS and its conquest of western Iraq and eastern Syria, where the worst kinds of depredations, and I don't have to list them for you, but you just have to think back what was on the news, people being burnt alive, beheaded. It was crazy. What ISIS found is that those videos, rather than repelling people, drove people to join the organization, generated even more support, both financially and otherwise, for the organization. They discovered that violence pays. And this is how ISIS was able to completely transform the nature of terrorism, become the first truly international terrorist group with 40,000 foreign fighters from at least 120 countries throughout the world. It was the beheadings of the Americans, of James Foley, Stephen Satloff, Peter Kassig, the 2 Britons and 2 Japanese. That's what actually appealed to their audience. It's what scholars J.M. Berger and Jessica Stern have called ultraviolence. This is exactly what Hamas adopted on October 7th, the use of ultraviolence. And it's not at all coincidental that an ISIS flag was found at Kibbutz Sufa, one of the 22 communities that were targeted. I'm not saying ISIS was involved. That's proof positive ISIS was an inspiration for this. And that's pretty chilling. As I said, terrorists already killed enough people. That's not enough for them anymore. And anybody who's seen that 43-minute compilation that Israel has done, that's taken from the GoPro cameras and the footage of Hamas fighters themselves, and then some of the security cameras around the rural settlements that were attacked, you understand that terrorism has reached a level of viciousness that isn't any longer isolated. That's part of the game. That's unfortunately part of the terrorist appeal. And then we get to basically what's happening at universities and elsewhere, where a new narrative is taking hold, where anything that the oppressed do against the oppressor, anything that the powerless, the would-be powerful do against the powerful, is now portrayed in a negative light and in very much of a north-south, West versus the rest of the world dynamic. So these are 2 quotes. The top one is from a professor at Columbia University, and the second one's from a professor from Virginia Commonwealth University in my own state. Why should we care about professors at universities who have absolutely, in many cases, have no real-world experience, spouting off on this and that? What worries me the most is they're educating a new generation of students. They're the ones going to be joining police force if they want, if they will, but coming into police forces, coming into government, coming into emergency services, coming into the intelligence community, coming into the military. This is, believe me, I teach them, this is a completely different generation of students where they don't want to engage in debate and dialogue. They already know the answers. And how do they know the answers? It's where they get their news. Recent report from the Reuters Institute at Oxford University shows that people under 40, over 2/3 of people under 40, prefer to get their news from social influencers than from journalists, okay? They want to be entertained. They want to be emotionally tickled, not receive objective, factually accurate news. For example, 2/3 of millennials, who are older than Generation Z, first source of news is Facebook, okay? I mean, unfortunately, I'm an old guy. To me, that's astonishing. First source of news for Generation Z, YouTube. And then, depending, it's Instagram figures in both. TikTok has a prominence. Think of the difference. Actual, real news. You have reporters that have to have multiple sources for their stories, that are fact-checked, and then have editors vetting that information. Who's doing that for social influencers? So an entirely new generation is growing up that not only can't separate fact from fiction, but often struggles to separate right from wrong. Even on my campus, even in the security studies program at Georgetown, which is about the biggest tent at that university, using the word terrorist, I've been on leave this year. I wonder what's going to happen when I come back in the fall, because my courses have the word terrorism in them. even among some segment of students, using the word terrorism is an unacceptable pejorative term now. You've got to use resistance fighter or freedom fighter or martyrs or something like that. And if you've read the first chapter of Inside Terrorism, you know this is not a new process, but it's now become the dominant meme. And this, I think, is going to have lots of repercussions as we go forward for the people that are going to succeed all of you in your jobs. Okay, let me wrap it up because I've obviously talked too long like every professor. Can the war be won, and what are the implications? I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of Henry Kissinger, the late Henry Kissinger, but he got it exactly right when he wrote this article in Foreign Affairs in 1975 assessing how and why the United States lost in Vietnam. And it has complete and total relevance and resonance to today. We fought a military war. Our opponents fought a political one. That's the difference between the war of narratives versus kinetics nowadays. We sought physical attrition. Our opponents aimed for our psychological exhaustion. That's exactly what terrorism is about. Bin Laden told us this in October 2004, just before the presidential election that year. He said, we know we can't defeat you militarily on the battlefield. We're going to undermine your resolve. We're going to counter your morale. We're going to send your daughters and sons back in body bags. We're going to bankrupt your treasury, and over time, we're going to succeed. I mean, who believed him back then? But then, of course, back then, I never thought the Taliban would be ruling Afghanistan once more. Then the final two sentences. In the process, we lost sight of one of the cardinal maxims of guerrilla war. And you can substitute terrorism. We're talking about irregular warfare here. The guerrilla or terrorist wins if he does not lose. The conventional army loses if it does not win. So let's think about that in the context of Gaza. So, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu had a brilliant idea. And it was brilliant if it worked. Right? Make peace with the surrounding Arab countries and the Abraham Accords. I mean, if there's one positive message in this entire presentation, it's that the Abraham Accords against all odds is held. United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco have not broken diplomatic relations with Israel, have not thrown the accords in the trash. But this is the trouble. And I have to say, in all my years of studying terrorism, it's not intelligence failures. It's the failures of policymakers to listen, and that's exactly what the Admiral was talking about this morning. In this case, Netanyahu was warned that there was this threat to Israel, but like many policymakers, he was so tunnel vision, so focused on the secret sauce he had invented that would succeed against all odds, that he remained completely oblivious to that, of course, at Israel's peril, where the intelligence and warning indicators. You know, it's like history may not repeat itself, but gosh, it sounds awfully familiar. When you read the accounts of the young IDF women deployed along the border as intelligence analysts, going to their superiors and being told that it was their imagination that Hamas was preparing the attack. Think back to Alex Station, the CIA station that was dedicated to countering bin Laden, that was staffed almost entirely by women, making the same kinds of warnings. I mean, was 9/11 an intelligence failure? Two CIA analysts, one of them a woman who I actually know very well, went down to President Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas on August 4th, 2001, and presented a briefing to him, bin Laden ready to strike the United States. It's not an intelligence failure. And this wasn't an intelligence failure. As you'll see on the next slide, well, slide after this, I'll come back to that. Or did I? Yeah. Sorry. So, is this a war that Hamas has already won? Now, on the positive side, there's not a lot of positives when 19,000 civilians are killed. And in fact, Peggy Noonan, I think more often than not, gets it exactly right. The next week after the, it must have been 2 weeks after the war started, she wrote, anything that's good for cable news is bad for humanity. 19,000, roughly 19,000 civilians dying is not good. Innocent civilians are innocent civilians, no matter what nationality they are. And in fact, you notice I'm not using 29,000. 29,000 is the official figure from the Gaza Health Ministry, which of course is run by Hamas. That neglects the 10 to 12,000 Hamas fighters that have been killed. So if you want to put the best face on it, let's say, be conservative, 10,000 fighters are dead. Usually the rule of thumb in warfare is about twice that number of casualties, although some casualties can return to the battlefield. IDF, considering Hamas has between 30,000 to 40,000 fighters, has done a pretty good job at an enormous cost at weakening the organization, but not eliminating it completely. We know that no terrorist group is just about kinetics. It's about an ideology, and it's a political being. So it's very hard to eliminate an ideology, the politics. And the cost has been enormous. The words genocide and apartheid, which were kind of fringe charges hurled against Israel, have beyond any doubt entered into the mainstream and I believe will forever be associated with Israel to its detriment. Israel is far more isolated now than it's ever been in its history, which was exactly Hamas's strategy. Hamas knew it wasn't going to conquer Israel. What it sought to do, what it has sought to do in every single war that it's fought with Israel since 2008 is isolate Israel, is cauterize it against the rest of the world. And we've seen that. What was once unqualified support has become pretty heavily qualified. So the cost to Israel, even if they succeed, I don't think they can eliminate Hamas, but even if they succeed in killing Yahya Sinwar, the leader, the repercussions and the consequences of this war are going to last for a long time afterwards and not be positive. This was the slide that I was thinking of. Okay. Another advantage in being in this field for a long time, and at least if you haven't completely lost your memory yet, is you think back and you put pieces together. And as October 7th was unfolding, at a long time that day to reflect on many different things as I was watching the news, not only did I grab my notebook with the Arafat interview, but I thought of a speech that the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, had given in 1996, almost 30 years ago. And in that speech, he invoked a verse from the Quran about the spider's web that looks strong from the outside, but once you get close to it, you just sweep it away with your hand. And nearly 30 years ago, Hassan Nasrallah likened Israel to the spider's web that looks strong from the outside, but is actually weakening within. And almost 30 years ago, he pointed to a society, and he was right, that was becoming much more materialistic, much more comfortable, that was losing the pioneering spirit, the spirit of sacrifice and unity that first had resulted in its creation, that was becoming politically more divided and more polarized, because a certain person had entered into the political system then in a big way. And basically, he talked about an Israel that eventually could be overwhelmed and defeated. And what's fascinating is that the Director General of Israeli Intelligence, Research and Analysis, Brigadier General Amit Sar, on two occasions last year, last March and last August, went to Prime Minister Netanyahu and warned that a perfect storm was brewing, that because of the political paralysis in Israel, the ongoing protests, the reservists refusing to report to duty, and so on, Israel's enemies were marshaling their forces to attack at what they thought was an ideal opportunity. And again, because of Netanyahu's tunnel vision, he ignored it. And in fact, what was fascinating is that Brigadier General Sar used very similar language to what Hassan Nasrallah had used 30 years before. Talked about that Israel's enemies perceived that the country had become a weak, divided society that will ultimately disappear and can be pushed into oblivion by a sharp blow delivered by terrorism. Exactly what happened, exactly what was ignored. Okay, final slide, and then I'll shut up. I don't have Andres here either to tell me to do so. What are the longer-term consequences for counterterrorism? Well, counterterrorism is all about deterrence, and that was pretty much shattered on October 7th. Whether Israel can regain that deterrence, I would say it's also a question for the West. I mean, our technological superiority that Israel had counted so much on was completely vitiated, was completely negated that day. You know, this is exactly what the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other groups have been saying, persistence and perseverance. When the Taliban reconquered Kabul in August 2021, they praised God, their God, for having delivered this victory to them, that having remained faithful, never given up, having gathered that strength, they were able to persist and persevere. And you know what were the first two countries that publicly announced their congratulations of Hamas and endorsed that strategy? Hezbollah and Hamas. And actually, by the way, not to channel my new book, but the Proud Boys was up there too, and also saying persistence and perseverance is exactly the way to go to conquer stronger enemies. So the question we're left with today is, will Iran's regional strategy and the terrorist local ones be validated by the outcome of this war? What's very worrisome to me is that terrorism is becoming legitimized now. People don't want to use the word, at least everybody agrees it's a negative word, but people don't want to use the word anymore. We're using all kinds of euphemisms to justify the worst excesses of violence. Think of the front page headline in the New York Times just a few weeks ago when Saleh al-Aruri, one of the leaders of Hamas, was killed. Senior Hamas tactician killed, right? So we're not calling them militants, we're not even calling them fighters. Now we're giving them some credit as being tacticians or fighters. This is a very dangerous development. And then I think the big question is that, will the spider web theory be validated? Because Tom Friedman, who I don't always necessarily agree with, but actually has recently had excellent analyses, has always made the point that Israel is the canary in the coal mine in terms of global trends, in terms of warfare. Will October 7th prove to be a canary in the coal mine that will embolden our own enemies, not least Iran, first and foremost, to use asymmetric tactics to undermine us? Thank you very much. And if you didn't know, I have a new book out, so I'll shamelessly advertise that. Thanks very much for your attention.